Welcome to the Inner Space Project podcast, where we explore the full spectrum of emotions, from joy and love to sadness and fear, taking you on an inner space journey that challenges societal norms, encourages open dialogue, and raises awareness about all the parts of us, including the ones that may seem dark and mysterious. I'm your host, Dr. Patti Ashley, psychotherapist, author, TEDx speaker, and clinical trainer. Thank you for joining me as we navigate the labyrinth of emotions, dismantle stigma, and pave the way for a more compassionate and connected world. So, welcome to the Inner Space Project podcast. And I'm your host, Dr. Patti Ashley here. Excited to do an interview today with a dear friend of mine, actually, and someone who I feel will bring so much wisdom to you in terms of what we're going to talk about today in the middle part of life. Those of you who've been following my podcast know that we're doing beginnings, middles, and endings. And so our guest today is going to talk about the middle part, talk about things in our life that affect us in various ways. And she's the author of 2 books. One of them is The Newcomer's Guide to the Invisible Realm, which is amazing for any of you who haven't really delved into what happens in other parts of ourselves, which is definitely a big piece of our inner space. And Marbles, the New and Collected Poems, delicious book with her beautiful poetry. So she's an author, storyteller, poet, dream reader, and laughter yoga leader. She tells traditional, personal, historical, and original stories to children and adults, and she's the 2024 recipient of the Reneaux Emerging Artist Award. You'll be able to hear her stories on Story Podcast and the Appleseed by BYU Radio, as well as her CDs, the Diffendaffer, Taffy Cafe, and Other Stories, and Simple, Clever, and Wise. So welcome, Laura Deal.
Thank you very much, Patti. It's a delight to be here.
It's so good to see you. I'm lucky to have spent many years getting to know you and working dreams with you and hearing what an incredible storyteller you are. I'm a little ADHD and dyslexic and auditorily challenged. So sometimes listening to stories is hard for me. I'll admit, I don't know if I've ever told you that or not, but your stories captivate me. And I've learned the value in the work that I've done with dreams and metaphors and archetype in my work and healing, how that can be so healing. And so to listen to you tell a story and how much passion you bring into your work is incredible. And you also did, I know we've got some questions I want to ask you. But what comes into my mind first, though, if that's okay, if I hijack, as Jeremy Taylor, our dream teacher, would say, I'm going to hijack your question.
Of course.
You did Chautauqua piece where you became Marianne Woodman, who was a Jungian analyst and feminist and incredibly powerful woman. And you embodied this person and you studied her for a year and you just put on this beautiful thing. So when we launch the podcast, I want to put some of those links into so maybe people can watch that. So anyway, there's a lot you've done. And I want to just start with some of these questions for you to kind of help us understand how this all works. Because, people think stories are for kids and what's the point? And yet as an adult, I'm learning, being around your storyteller community, how valuable they are. How does listening to stories impact emotional health?
I think there's so many ways that storytelling helps us with our emotions. Stories give us a safe way to experience that wide range of emotion that can happen. And the way it does that is that we're imagining that story as we hear it. And so we tend to connect with whatever the character in the story is going through. And this indirect way of experiencing emotion fools the brain into responding with, this physical response that is just like we're experiencing that directly. It's that neural mirroring that happens as a storyteller tells the story and the audience listens. their brains start to sync up and experience the same thing. And so it's a way of allowing people to experience things that they wouldn't ordinarily experience, and then process those emotions and come to a safe conclusion at the end of the story. I've also, as you mentioned in the bio, I also am a laughter yoga leader. And one of the things that the clinical studies of laughter yoga have shown, they did one where they just had people watching other people doing laughter yoga. And the people watching had their heart rates go up, their respiration went up. So they were experiencing what the people who were actually doing it were experiencing. And the same thing happens with storytelling. It allows us to feel connected with one another. I was just reading about a study that was done with children in a hospital, and they brought in storytellers to tell stories that the child could pick from I think they had a dozen stories, or the control was that they would do riddles. And in both cases, the children felt that connection with the person offering the input. But with the storytelling, it was even more profound. Their pain levels were reduced, their stress levels were reduced, their oxytocin was increased, and the children were able to interact more comfortably with their caregivers after this storytelling session. Wow. So it's just incredible. And, I tell stories to kindergarten students as one of the things I do. And I think the folk tales that I share with them help them understand that people can get really angry and still find peaceful solutions to their problems, that it's okay to feel sad when something sad happens, and that hard things happen to a lot of people, and people find ways to cope and get through that. Yeah, I think stories in general foster compassion because we understand other people through it. It's like doing dream work, as you know. It's one of the most compassionate things we can do. We begin to understand that other people are not so different than we are, and that our experiences as a human being are universal. So it makes it a little safer, I think, to feel all those big feelings sometimes.
Yeah, and I love that you're talking about some of the research, because in my field, it's really important for us to have this evidence-based information to prove these things. And sometimes, back in the day, it was just people listened to stories, they connected with one another, the oral traditions went on, and there was just something captivating and connecting in the experience. But now we have to have research to prove how it all works. So in my research on trauma and shame, I've learned how important it is to do what you were just saying, to activate those mirror neurons in connected relationship with others, and to actually create new neural pathways in the right brain, which is our sensory feeling piece. And so when I put it together, because I've loved the dream work and the storytelling for years, and then actually in the research is showing up and saying, yeah, this stuff really does work. So I love that you shared that. And that's why I wanted you to come on, because I think it's hard for people to see that, because they think, oh, it's just a story. But it isn't just a story. It's so profound and healing and so important, especially these days. We got
and the group I volunteer with, it's Spellbinders, and the training that we go through with that, we learn all about how storytelling is good for children's brains, and it helps them with literacy and all these different things. And I remember when I first heard that, I have a very snarky side to me sometimes, and I thought, imagine, this most profound and ancient art that's quintessentially human is good for people's brains. But it's good for their hearts and souls as well. And that's a little squishier. We don't talk about that so much in the training, but I've definitely seen it, students brought to tears by a story that touched their heart. And, I don't know what's happening in their life that particular story is resonating so profoundly in that moment, but it clearly is reaching them at an emotional level.
And we know now with the heart-brain coherence and that research that's been done, that the heart is actually the regulatory organ. And when we regulate the heart, it actually helps the brain chemistry as well. So it's all interconnected. But yeah, I agree with you. I just felt like it was something that was helpful. And, again, to have the research to back it up is pretty sweet and cool. So talk about metaphor, the importance of metaphor in some of these traditional tales.
Well, I mean, as you know, as a dream worker, the traditional tales are full of metaphors. And on an unconscious level, they allow the listener to sympathize with both the heroine or the hero and the monster in the story at some level. And while on the surface, we may think that's a story about someone doing something clever to overcome the ogre or whatever it is, the story is also teaching us at that experiential level that there are ogres inside of us that can be tamed through that conscious understanding. And that it's not just, stories that get told to children. I've worked through some very difficult childhood messages that I received from my dad working with the story of the Handless Maiden and feeling that resonance that I experience with that moment when the father essentially, literally in the story, cuts off his daughter's hands in order to have wealth and power. And what that spoke to me about, my dad, who was a Depression era kind of guy, and always after pinching those pennies and cutting me off from my art because of that, because he wanted me to have a practical job. And it's helped me work through some of that to have that metaphor. And I also, I know a storyteller who had told this one particular story over and over again. And one night she was up on stage and she's telling this story, and all of a sudden she had this profound aha, this realization of what the metaphor in that story really meant to her. She told the story many times, and then in that moment, it was like, oh, this is about something entirely different. Mm-hmm. And it was only her vast experience as a storyteller that allowed her to finish the story on the stage and then, save that emotional impact for when she was alone later. So the stories work on us in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and it makes me think your dream work and how we talk about it's multi-layered, and it can go on to infinity. And here she is having this aha in that moment after she's been telling the story. I would like for you to share, though, with our listeners about the Handless Maiden and what happened, because you gave us the beginning of having your hands cut off. What happens in the story that then you got to see in terms of your own transformation?
Ultimately, the maiden wanders and she encounters a prince, and he makes silver hands for her. And in the version of the story that spoke to me the most, and I think it's Clarissa Pinkola Estes has it in her book, the moment when the maiden drops her baby in the river and reaches into the river and pulls the baby out and her hands have regrown. To me, that was mapping it onto my life. I could see how once I became an adult and became a parent, I learned how to advocate for my children and for their art. And that helped me learn to advocate for myself. And when I say advocate, it's not like there was anybody outside me at that point telling me not to do it. The voices were all internal. And so it was a way for me to explore those experiences that I had and map them onto a story so that it had a container, and it made it possible for me to really fully understand what I had gone through. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to add about the metaphors. You mentioned Marion Woodman at the beginning, and one of the things I love that she talks about is that metaphors work on us on all the levels of mind, body, and soul. And that moment of aha that we get when a metaphor finally speaks to us on all those levels, that's transformative. That takes us into a new realm of consciousness about ourselves, about the world. So, and stories like Little Red Riding Hood, you tell that story to a 5-year-old child, they're going to take it in as kind of a literal story. And maybe they get the lesson of, don't walk off the forest path because there are wild animals out there. And it's not until they're older that they begin to understand that wolf is a metaphor for predatory people, and that the story has many, many layers. And that's one of those stories that I never liked and I never wanted to tell until I was able to finally approach it from a different angle and get into a different level of the story. So I think the metaphors allow us to understand things at all those different levels.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. Again, because metaphor activates the right brain is what I've learned. And so when we activate the right brain, we get into our right brain is our sensing, feeling, and our left brain is our thinking, analyzing. So we get more into the sensing, feeling, and we create new neural pathways. And so just to have the image of Little Red Riding Hood or the Handless Maiden or whatever the story may be gives us something more than saying, well, you want to stay away from predators. There's predators out there. There's bad people. But there's a story, there's a feeling to, whoa, that was, wow, what big eyes you have, what big teeth you have, and you go, whoa, and you feel something. And so again, I that's why I'm so appreciative of your work and the way you're able to help people kind of feel into that as you tell us.
Well, and that feeling, it's interesting you bring that up, because when we experience a bigger emotion, our memories are stronger about that experience. And so that's another reason why stories stay with people. I had been telling in the kindergarten level, and then I had the first grade classes, and then I finally got the second grade classes. And I walked into the second grade class, and these kids had heard me tell stories when they were in kindergarten, but not in first grade. Mm-hmm. So they'd had a whole year without seeing me. And that first time I went, I said, what stories do you remember? And they started as a group. They came up with 8 or 10 different stories that they had heard when they were 5 years old. And now they were, 7 or 8. And the teacher was absolutely stunned.
Wow.
That they had hung on to those for so long. So there is something about that emotional impact that makes the stories stick.
And I love that you do that. I went in when my kids were little and read Grimm's fairy tales and thought they wouldn't understand it, but they were like, more, read me some more. That even in old English, is that what it is? The old English language. I was like, I found it at a thrift store or something, and I was shocked. These kids loved it. So yeah. I love that you do that, because again, we're wired for stories, and kids are so innocent, and so they just take it in. So how do you think people can use personal storytelling to improve emotional health?
So for some people, I think just telling their story to an attentive listener is enough to lift the burdens of whatever they're feeling with that story. I mean, it's like you go to your friend and you say, this happened and this happened and this happened. And, they don't have to solve it. They just have to listen. So we've all experienced that at some level, but maybe it's deeper, and maybe it's like a secret that feels shameful, but then once it's told, we realize that other people have been through that and it doesn't have as much weight in our psyche. Maybe it's a grief that feels completely overwhelming, but then in the telling and being heard, the pain gets eased, and the audience gets to relate to the storyteller, like we were talking about earlier. I think that's why The Moth is so popular as a storytelling platform. The storytellers get to frame their experience, and even though it's utterly personal, happened to them, it's also connecting with the audience because they're imagining that experience and connecting it to their own life and things that have happened to them. So they bring their own understanding to those stories.
So what is The Moth?
The Moth is a story slam that people come and tell a story based on a theme for the night. And it's a competitive, they have a winner, which the more I get into it, the less I'm into competitive art. Um, but it provides this place for people to go and share their stories in front of a large audience, and then that audience gets to experience those personal stories. So it's very much the same mechanism as listening to a traditional tale, but it's happening on a more personal level. And the fact that the moth has become so popular, I think it speaks to the need for that in our culture. That people need to be heard, people need to hear other people's stories. It's presented as an entertainment, but I think it's serving a much deeper need than that. And then there's also narrative therapy, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I have a good friend who does a lot of narrative therapy, and my understanding of it is that helps us take what they call a skinny story. My parents didn't honor who I was as a child. That was my skinny story. And as I work with thinking about that story and thinking about their lives, I can remind myself that they were products of their own time and their own upbringing, and that they were delivering those messages, which might have been painful to me, but they were delivering them with love. They wanted me to succeed in life. And it helps me get a wider story, a thicker story, so that I'm not so locked into that one little piece that keeps going over and over again about they didn't honor who I was. They didn't care about my art, So it helps with healing in a lot of ways, telling personal stories.
Yeah, and I, in my work with grief, heard many years ago that you have to tell the story at least 100 times. And because it moves the energy too out of our body, and again it fuels that connection with the other person. And shame, once we tell a shame story and it's out, it really changes how we've been holding the shame in our body. So my work with grief and shame, telling the story is so important. And I don't think people realize that, because I think we don't want to talk. This is part of why I'm doing the Inner Space Project, because we don't want to talk about these things, right? We want to just be in our day-to-day, get our jobs done, and take care of business. And we don't talk about really what's going on with connecting, our need for connection, emotional connection, and the stories that we hold in our body, and how it can literally make us physically sick if we don't move the energy of holding inside of us. And telling the story, that's why I wrote my book Letters to Freedom, to write the stories of after my fiance died, because I felt like I didn't want to burden. I'm always afraid too of burdening my friends. I've burdened you many times, Laura Deal, with my stories, and it's such a gift. I treasure my friends like you who are in my life that I can tell these stories to. And it's a very safe, sacred place when you can have somebody who can listen to your story. Well, I would love to have you back on the show at some point, and maybe you can actually tell us a story. Because
that would be fun.
Because of time today, I think we're kind of just going to wrap up with a few general questions I ask all of my guests about inner space. Speaking of inner space, nice segue into that. I created the Inner Space Project because of that, what I just mentioned. I don't think we're really having these conversations enough. And I think if we can explore outer space without exploring inner space, we're kind of missing a huge piece of the human experience here on the earth. So what are your thoughts about exploring what I'm calling inner space, or that place inside us that contains our full spectrum of emotions, from joy and love to sadness and fear? What are your thoughts about exploring that inner space?
As a storyteller and a dream explorer, I'm all about it. I think what we don't explore and bring to consciousness remains in shadow, to use the Jungian phraseology. It remains unconscious if we don't think about it. And if it's ignored or stuffed down, then it, like you were saying, it can become an actual physical ailment as well as an emotional struggle. And so when we work with storytelling or with sharing our dreams, it reminds us that we're part of this shared humanity, and that as humans, we have strengths and flaws, and none of us are perfect. And so it can bring a lot more peace to own and recognize those emotions and to really grasp that sense of our full humanity.
Yes, I completely agree. So, how do you think that raising mental health awareness impacts individuals and communities?
Well, from what I have seen, the more we can make people aware of mental health and mental illness, the more that we'll have tools to deal with challenges, and people will be more willing to seek help. And I think in a community setting, as we've increased awareness as a society about mental health challenges, I think we're seeing that there are opportunities to handle situations with more compassion and less force. And I think that overall that would be a very healing way to go in our culture. So I think it helps overall, to help people remember that you never know what somebody's going through, and
Right,
what they're experiencing.
right. Compassion, like we talk about imagining people's dreams and having compassion for their experience. So, any tools or tips that you might recommend to help people foster emotional literacy and agency?
Well, my favorite thing currently is laughter yoga,
Yeah, I love that.
which is a great way to allow the body to release that emotional expression and tension. And sometimes when you start laughing really hard, that morphs into tears and it all just flows out, like you were saying, getting it to flow through makes for a much healthier space, inner space. Um, and then I think, just things like getting into the body, dancing, doing breath work, I think is essential as a way for me, if I get it out on the page, then it doesn't do the little hamster wheel thing in my brain so much if I can actually make it concrete. And then sharing stories with trusted friends, and of course, dream work.
Yeah.
Those are my tools.
Yeah, I love those are all my tools too. I know sometimes we'll get together and we'll laugh for hours and it's so healing. So I don't think it even has to be laughter yoga, laughter itself. Like I love to watch comedy shows and I love to get together and laugh with friends and tell stories and do dream work. So I love that. Anything else just to wrap up?
I just want to say thank you for doing this project. I think it's crucial in the world that people can get in touch with that inner realm and figure out what's going on inside them a little bit. So thank you for all the work you're putting into it. I think it'll have a wonderful impact.
Well, thank you, Laura. I mean, that means a lot to me. You've been involved in my creative ideas and you get it. So I appreciate that. Where can people find you? www.lauradeal.com. Is that?
Yeah, that's my storytelling, all things storytelling website. I also have firstchurchofmetaphor.com, which is where I do a more exploration of dream imagery and poetry and that sort of thing.
Okay. And I know we won't air this for a while, but you've got some shows in town and you do some Zoom things. So all that, they can find all that on your website. Thank you so much. Again, hope we can have you back and you can tell us a story at some point in this journey at the Inner Space Project.
Okay. Thanks very much, Patti.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this inner space journey and we'll come back again for the upcoming episodes. For more information about the Inner Space Project and all the other offerings I have for you, please visit my website, www.pattiashley.com, PATTIASHLEY. Thanks again, and I'll see you real soon.